The whole town laughed when she raised her hand and said, $2. They thought it was a joke. Some even clapped, as if the auction had turned into a bit of afternoon entertainment. The old burned silo sat at the far edge of Miller's Field, blackened by fire, forgotten by time, and leaning just enough to make folks uneasy. It had not held grain in years. It had not held hope in even longer. But she stood there in her plain cotton dress and worn boots, calm as Sunday morning, and claimed it like it was the finest piece of land in the county. No one believed she knew what she was doing. The fire had come through 3 summers back, a dry July when lightning struck the roof and flames licked the sky for half the night. By the time the volunteer fire brigade rolled in with their rattling truck, the wooden top had already caved in and the inside was charred nearly to the stone. After that, it became nothing more than a landmark for gossip. Children dared each other to step inside. Farmers shook their heads when they drove past. Folks said it ought to be torn down before it fell and crushed someone. But no one wanted to spend money on tearing down a burned silo that stood on land no one claimed with pride. That is how it ended up at auction. $2 cash. She had arrived in town only 6 months before, riding in on a bus that coughed more smoke than the old factory chimney by the river. She rented a small room above the feed store and kept mostly to herself. People said she had come from farther east, maybe from a place where the winters were harsher and the work even harder. She never corrected anyone. She worked odd jobs, mending clothes, cleaning church pews, helping old widows sort through attic trunks. She paid in exact change and kept her back straight. There was something steady about her. That steadiness unsettled people. When word spread that she had bought the burned silo for $2, the town barber nearly dropped his scissors. The grocer laughed so hard he had to sit down. At the diner, where stories were traded like baseball cards, the men at the counter took turns guessing how long it would be before the thing collapsed on her. "She learn," one of them said, stirring his coffee. "That old silo ain't good for nothing but shade." They were wrong about one thing. She had not bought it for what it was. She had bought it for what it could be. The silo stood round and stubborn, built of thick field stone laid by hands long gone. Even after the fire, the walls held strong. The roof was ruined, yes, and the wooden door hung crooked on one hinge. Ash still coated the floor inside. But when she first stepped through that doorway, she did not see ruin. She saw space, she saw light pouring down from the broken top. She saw quiet. In the evenings, after finishing her day's work, she walked out to Miller's Field with a bucket and a broom. At first, people thought she was only clearing debris. But she kept coming back. She swept the ash. She hauled out broken boards. She pulled weeds from around the base and stacked fallen stones in neat piles. She patched the door with scrap wood she found behind the lumber yard. She worked alone. A few children watched from a distance, whispering like she might be casting a spell. One afternoon, the pastor stopped by, hat in hand. He asked her plain and simple, "What are you planning to do with that old thing?" She smiled in a way that did not give much away. "I reckon I'll make something useful." That answer traveled faster than a summer storm. In a small American town, usefulness is measured in corn yield and fence lines. A burned silo did not fit either. Yet she kept at it. She borrowed tools when she could, paid for nails one small box at a time, and even climbed a borrowed ladder to inspect the damaged roof. From below, folks saw her silhouette against the sky and shook their heads. A woman working on a structure like that was not a common sight. Still, she did not ask for help. As the weeks passed, something curious began to happen. The laughter softened. It did not disappear, but it changed. People grew interested. They noticed the stones being cleaned, one by one, scrubbed until their original gray returned. They noticed the new wooden frame rising inside, sturdy and square. They noticed that she had laid down a fresh floor over the blackened earth. And then came the windows. No one expected windows in a silo. Yet one morning there were 2 round openings cut clean into the stone, framed with salvaged wood and fitted with glass panes she must have hauled from somewhere far off. When the sun hit just right, light spilled through those windows like honey. The children stopped whispering and started peeking inside. What they saw surprised them. The inside was no longer dark and hollow. It was warm. She had whitewashed the walls. She had built shelves that curved with the round stone. She had set a small iron stove in the corner, the pipe reaching carefully through a patched section of roof. There was a table in the center, plain but sturdy. On it sat a stack of books tied with twine. Books were not rare in town, but they were not plentiful either. When the first cold wind of autumn swept across the fields, smoke rose from the silo's chimney. The sight of it startled more than a few farmers on their way home. Smoke meant life. Smoke meant purpose. The diner talk shifted. What's she doing in there? Heard she's making it into some kind of reading room. For who? That question lingered the longest. She did not put up a sign. She did not announce an opening. She simply left the door ajar one Saturday afternoon. A single lantern hung above the doorway. Inside, the stove glowed soft and red. The first to step in was a boy with dirt on his knees and curiosity in his eyes. He circled the room slowly, touching the shelves like they might disappear. She offered him a book without fuss. He sat at the table and began to read. By sunset, there were 4 children inside, heads bent close together. The town noticed, in the days that followed, more books appeared. Some were old-school primers, others were novels with cracked spines, and a few were almanacs and farming guides. No one saw her bring them in. They simply arrived, stacked neatly, waiting for hands to turn their pages. A few adults wandered in too, pretending to look for their children. They lingered longer than they meant to. The burned silo was no longer burned in spirit. It had become something else entirely, though no one quite knew what to call it. It was not a church, not a school, not a shop, yet it held pieces of all 3. It was a place to gather, to learn, to sit in quiet thought. Some folks felt pride, others felt uneasy. Change, even small change, can stir up more than dust. One evening, as the sky turned the color of faded denim, the mayor himself walked out to Miller's Field. He stood outside the round stone walls and studied the glow from within. Laughter drifted through the open door, soft and bright. He stepped inside, hat in hand, and looked around at the shelves, the stove, the circle of children listening as she read from a thick book about distant lands. He cleared his throat. The room fell silent. He spoke kindly enough, but there was weight in his words. "This here building," he said, tapping the stone wall, "was never zoned for public use." The word zone sounded heavy in that small, warm space. She did not flinch. She set the book down gently and met his eyes. "It was zoned for grain," she replied. "I'm just storing something different." A few of the older men shifted where they stood. The children looked between them, unsure. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the patched roof. The mayor glanced around once more, taking in the clean stone, the careful shelves, the steady stove. What had been a burned silo worth $2 now held more life than some buildings 10 times its size. And that was the part that troubled certain people. Because if a woman with $2 and stubborn hope could turn a charred silo into something the town needed, then what excuse did the rest of them have? He adjusted his hat and said he would have to discuss matters with the council. There were permits, regulations, safety concerns, words that could close doors just as easily as they opened them. When he stepped back out into the fading light, the warmth seemed to follow him. Inside, she picked up the book again. Her voice did not tremble, but her eyes flicked once toward the doorway, toward the uncertain future waiting beyond it. The children leaned closer as she turned the page. Outside, clouds gathered low over Miller's Field, and in the distance, thunder rolled like a warning. By the next morning, a notice would be nailed to the wooden door of the old silo, and the town would have to decide whether the $2 dream was worth protecting or tearing down. But for now, the lantern burned steady, and the story inside those stone walls was only just beginning. By morning, the notice was there. It had been nailed straight into the patched wooden door, the paper stiff and official, stamped with the town seal in blue ink. The wind tugged at its corners, but the nail held firm. A few early risers saw it first. The milk truck driver slowed down long enough to read it twice. The woman who opened the post office covered her mouth with her hand. Word spread before the sun had fully cleared the treetops. The notice stated that the structure formerly known as the Miller Silo was being reviewed for safety and zoning compliance. Until further evaluation, public gatherings were to be suspended. Failure to comply could result in fines or removal of the building. Those words sat heavy on the field. She arrived just after 8, carrying a crate of donated books balanced on her hip. She saw the paper before she reached the door. For a moment she did not move. The grass shifted around her boots. Somewhere behind the trees a crow called out. A few children stood nearby, silent and watching her face. They had come early, hoping to finish the chapter she had begun the night before. They looked from the notice to her and back again, as if waiting for instruction. She set the crate down slowly. Her fingers traced the edge of the paper, not tearing it down, not yet. She read every word twice, then stepped back. The children searched her expression for anger or fear. Instead, they found something quieter, something steadier. "Well," she said at last, brushing dust from her skirt, "guess we'll be reading outside today." The children broke into small smiles, unsure but willing. They carried the books out into the open field. She spread an old quilt under the shade of a lone oak tree near the silo. The stone walls stood behind them, solid and round, the whitewashed interior hidden for now. She began to read where she had left off, her voice rising and falling with the breeze. Across the road, 2 farmers leaned against a fence and watched. By noon, half the town had passed by to take a look at the notice. Some nodded as if it was only a matter of time. Others frowned. A few whispered that maybe it was best to keep things as they were, quiet and unchanged. A reading room in a burned silo was one thing. A public gathering spot was another. The mayor called for a council meeting that evening at the town hall. It was said to be about safety, about permits, about protecting citizens, but everyone knew it was about more than that. She did not attend. Instead, she stayed in the field long after the children went home. She walked around the silo slowly, pressing her palm against the cool stone. The building had been raised nearly 80 years ago by a family that no longer lived in town. It had survived storms, droughts, and neglect. It had survived fire. Now it faced something quieter but just as dangerous: paper. That night, as lamps flickered in kitchen windows across town, the council gathered. The town hall smelled of old wood and coal dust. Men in work shirts filled the back benches. A few women sat together near the front, hands folded tight in their laps. The mayor cleared his throat and laid the notice on the long table. "This ain't personal," he began. "It's about responsibility." He spoke about building codes and liability. About how if someone were injured inside that structure, the town could be held accountable. He reminded them that the silo had been declared unsafe after the fire. He mentioned that no official permit had been requested for renovations. From the back of the room, the barber raised a hand. "Has anyone been hurt?" The mayor hesitated. "That's not the point," another voice called out, softer but firm. "The children are reading in there. Ain't that better than wandering the tracks?" Murmurs filled the room. The council argued late into the night. Some feared setting a precedent. Others feared what it would say about the town if they shut down something that had brought light into a dark place. The word progress floated through the air, though no one quite claimed it. While they debated, she sat at the small table inside the silo, a single lantern burning low. She had taken the notice down before nightfall and folded it neatly. It rested beside her elbow. Around her, the shelves curved along the walls, holding stories and histories and dreams that did not belong to any one person. She ran her hand along the stone, feeling its strength. She had not come to town by accident. Long before the bus ride, long before the auction, she had lived in a place where buildings were torn down without thought, where old structures were replaced by new ones that felt hollow. She had watched a small schoolhouse close its doors because it did not meet new standards. She had watched books boxed up and hauled away. She had seen what happened when community slipped through cracks in paperwork. When she saw the burned silo standing alone in Miller's Field, she did not see damage. She saw possibility. She saw a chance to build something rooted in stone, something that could not be pushed aside easily. But she had underestimated one thing: pride. In a town built on tradition, any change felt like a question, and questions made people uneasy. The next morning, she rose before dawn. Instead of waiting for another notice or another meeting, she walked to the hardware store. The owner looked surprised to see her so early. "I need to know what it would take," she said plainly, To make that silo meet every safety rule this town has. He scratched his chin. That's a tall order, then write it down. By midday she had a list longer than her arm. Reinforce the roof beams, install proper ventilation, add a second exit, secure the stove pipe with certified fittings, apply for a zoning variance, schedule inspections. Each item carried a cost. $2 had bought the silo. It would take far more to protect it. When she returned to the field, a small crowd waited. Not angry, not cheering, just watching. The boy who had been the first to step inside weeks ago approached her. Are they gonna tear it down? She crouched so their eyes were level. Not if we've got something worth standing up for. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. The barber showed up with a toolbox. He did not make a speech. He simply asked where to start. A farmer followed with spare lumber. The woman from the post office brought a tin of coins collected from her counter jar. No one called it a fundraiser. No one used big words. They just began. By evening, a new beam was being measured across the top opening. Plans for a side door were sketched in chalk on the stone. The field buzzed with quiet purpose. But not everyone was pleased. Across town, a small group met in the back room of the diner. They spoke in low tones about order and control, about how rules existed for a reason. One man argued that if she succeeded, others might start bending guidelines too. Another worried about property values. They decided to file a formal complaint with the county office, pushing for immediate enforcement before any more changes could be made. The tension thickened like summer heat. A week later, a county inspector's truck rolled into Miller's field, tires crunching over gravel. The man who stepped out carried a clipboard and wore a look that suggested he had seen many hopeful projects fail. She met him at the door. He walked the perimeter slowly, tapping the stone, inspecting the new beams, measuring the distance to the road. He asked questions about capacity, about emergency exits, about structural integrity. She answered each one without rushing. The townspeople gathered at a distance, silent. When the inspector stepped inside, he paused. Sunlight streamed through the round windows. The whitewashed walls reflected warmth. The shelves were fuller now, books donated from attics and barns. A small chalkboard hung near the entrance with the week's reading schedule written in careful script. He ran his hand along the curve of the wall. "You've done more than patch it," he said quietly. She nodded. He made notes on his clipboard, expression unreadable. Outside, the wind lifted dust into the air. The crowd shifted, waiting. At last he closed the folder. "There are issues," he announced, voice carrying across the field. "Significant ones." A few shoulders slumped. He continued, listing improvements still required. Fireproof insulation around the stove, reinforced anchoring for the roof cap, official approval from the zoning board at the county level. "Until those are addressed," he said, "the structure cannot operate as a public facility." The word cannot echoed. He climbed back into his truck and drove off, leaving behind a field full of uncertainty. That evening, as the sun dipped low, she stood alone inside the silo. The room felt different, heavier. The lantern flickered against the stone. On the table lay the growing list of requirements. Beside it, a small stack of donations collected that day. Coins, crumpled bills, a promise scribbled on scrap paper. It was not enough. She stepped outside and looked at the town in the distance. Lights glowed in windows. Smoke curled from chimneys. Life carried on. Behind her, the burned silo stood solid and patient. Somewhere beyond the fields, thunder rumbled again, low and distant. Another storm was on its way, and the roof still needed anchoring. She tightened her shawl against the rising wind. If the storm hit before the repairs were finished, it could undo weeks of work. If the county denied the variance, it could undo everything. And as the first drop of rain struck the stone, she realized that the fight for the $2 silo was no longer just about books or beams or permits. It was about whether a small town was ready to believe in something new rising from what had once been burned. The clouds gathered thick overhead, and in the fading light, the future of the silo hung by more than nails and paper. The rain came down harder than anyone expected. By the time the storm rolled fully over Miller's field, the sky had turned the color of iron. Wind pushed against the round stone walls of the old silo, testing every new beam and nail. The fresh boards on the roof groaned under pressure. She stood inside, one hand braced against a shelf, listening to the storm drum above her head. Water found its way through a thin seam near the roof cap and trickled down the wall. Not a flood, not yet, but enough to remind her that time was not on her side. Outside, a few men tried to hold down a loose tarp they had fastened earlier that afternoon. The barber slipped in the mud but got back up without complaint. The farmer who had donated lumber shouted instructions over the wind. The children had been sent home before the rain began, but some of them watched from porches across the road, faces pressed to window glass. The storm did not last long, but it left a mark. By morning, the field was soaked and the ground around the silo soft as sponge cake. The patched section of roof held, but barely. One of the temporary braces inside had shifted a full inch. She moved slowly around the room, checking each shelf, each joint. A few books near the damp wall had curled at the edges. She set them aside to dry. When she stepped outside, the town looked different. Rain has a way of washing the dust off everything, even old grudges, but it also reveals cracks. The formal complaint filed by the diner group reached the county office faster than expected. 2 days after the storm, a letter arrived at the post office addressed to her. It stated that due to multiple concerns raised by residents, the county zoning board would hold a hearing regarding the structure's status. Until then, all activity inside the silo was to cease entirely. Not reading outside, not gathering in small numbers. Cease entirely. The post office clerk handed her the envelope with a look that mixed sympathy and worry. "They're serious this time," she whispered. She nodded once and tucked the letter into her satchel. By noon, the news had spread again. The field felt empty without children's voices. The oak tree cast shade over nothing but damp grass. The silo door stayed closed. Inside town hall, the mayor paced. He had not expected the complaint to escalate so quickly. He had hoped the inspector's list would slow things down, not stir things up. Now the matter was out of his hands and moving toward the county board, where strangers would decide the fate of a building they had never stepped inside. At the diner, the group who had filed the complaint sat straighter in their booths. They spoke of safety and fairness. One man insisted it was about keeping order. Another said if she wanted a public library, she should build one properly on approved land. The word burned still lingered in their conversations, as if the fire from years ago made the stone itself untrustworthy. Across town, a different kind of meeting took place in the back room of the feed store. The barber, the farmer, the post office clerk, and 2 school teachers gathered around a wooden table. They were not loud. They did not call themselves organizers, but they shared a common thought. The children needed that place. One of the teachers spoke first. "We don't have enough books in the school. We haven't for years. The county keeps cutting the budget." The farmer rubbed his hands together. "It ain't just books. My boy sits in there quiet as I've ever seen him. Says it feels like something important." They discussed fundraising, legal advice, and whether anyone knew a lawyer in the next town over who might help. They knew the cost would be more than coins in a jar. Meanwhile, she stayed mostly out of sight. She continued making repairs quietly, focusing on what she could control. She reinforced the stove area with extra sheet metal borrowed from a retired mechanic. She added sand buckets near the entrance as a fire precaution. She measured and remeasured the angle of the new roof beam. But she did not reopen the door. The children began leaving small notes slipped under the threshold. Crayon drawings of the round building with smoke curling from the chimney. Messages written in uneven letters asking when storytime would return. She collected each one and placed them carefully in a wooden box beneath the table. The tension in town deepened in subtle ways. Friends avoided certain topics. At the barber shop, conversations would pause when someone from the diner group walked in. At church, the pastor preached about community and responsibility, choosing his words carefully so no one could accuse him of taking sides. One evening, the mayor knocked on her door at the room above the feed store. It was the first time he had visited her there. She invited him in without hesitation. The room was simple, a narrow bed, a small stove, a desk by the window. On the desk lay papers filled with neat handwriting. Plans, estimates, notes from the hardware store. He removed his hat and stood awkwardly near the door. "This has gotten bigger than I thought," he admitted. She poured him a cup of coffee from a dented pot. "It was always going to." He looked around the small room, then back at her. "You could step back, let it cool off. Maybe reopen later with proper permits in place. And if the board denies it?" He did not answer right away. "They might," he said finally. "The complaint carries weight." She folded her hands on the table. "So does silence." He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to understand what drove her. Most people would have walked away after the first notice. Most would have taken the loss and found quieter work. "You're not from here," he said softly. "No, why fight this hard for our town?" She did not speak of the schoolhouse that had closed in her past. She did not speak of watching books carried out like unwanted furniture. She simply said, "Because I know what happens when no one does." The county hearing was set for 2 weeks away. Notices were posted on the town bulletin board and printed in the small local paper. Residents were invited to attend and voice their opinions. As the date approached, the field remained quiet. The silo stood like a witness, its round walls holding both hope and doubt. Then another complication surfaced. A man from a development company visited town hall with blueprints tucked under his arm. He had heard about the burned silo and the ongoing dispute. He represented investors interested in purchasing portions of Miller's Field for a storage facility. Modern units, metal siding, reliable income for the town. The old silo, he said plainly, would need to be removed for the project to move forward. The mayor felt the ground shift beneath him. The proposal promised jobs and tax revenue. It promised growth. It also threatened to erase the very structure at the center of the conflict. Word of the development plan reached her through the barber, who arrived breathless at the field one afternoon. She listened without interrupting, her gaze fixed on the stone wall. "So it ain't just about zoning," he said. "There's money in this now." Money had a way of changing arguments. The diner group warmed to the idea quickly. Progress, they called it, opportunity. They pointed out that a modern storage facility would serve practical needs. The reading room, they argued, served sentiment. At the feed store meeting, worry turned sharper. The teachers feared that once the silo was gone, any chance of a community library would vanish with it. The farmer spoke of land sold piece by piece until nothing familiar remained. The conflict widened beyond one woman and a $2 purchase. It became a question of what kind of future the town wanted. The night before the hearing, she returned to the silo alone. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, lighting the lantern as she had done so many evenings before. The room felt smaller without the children's laughter, yet stronger somehow. She sat at the table and opened the wooden box of notes. She read each one slowly. One drawing showed the silo standing tall against a bright blue sky. A banner across it that read "Our Place." Another note simply said, "Please don't let them take it." Outside, the wind stirred again, gentler this time. She knew the hearing would not be simple. The zoning board would ask about fire safety, structural integrity, liability insurance. They would ask whether a burned silo could truly be made safe for public use. They would weigh economic development against community gathering. They would listen to complaints and praise in equal measure. And somewhere in that room would sit the development man with his clean blueprints and steady smile. She rose and walked the circumference of the interior wall, her fingers grazing the cool stone. Each block had been set by someone decades ago, someone who believed in building for the long haul. The fire had scarred it, yes, but it had not destroyed it. She stopped beneath the roof and looked up at the patched beams. "If you can stand," she murmured softly, "so can we." The next morning, townspeople gathered outside town hall earlier than usual. The air held a tight kind of energy. The diner group arrived together, papers in hand. The feed store group stood near the steps, quiet but determined. Parents brought their children, who clutched books against their chests as if they were proof of something. The mayor watched from the doorway, knowing that whatever happened inside would ripple through the town for years. She walked up the steps alone. The hearing room filled quickly. County officials sat behind a long table, files stacked high. The development man took a seat near the front. The inspector from the field flipped through his clipboard. When her name was called, she stood. For a brief moment, the room went still. She felt the weight of every gaze, every expectation, every doubt. She thought of the storm, of the rain slipping through the roof. She thought of the children reading under the oak tree. She thought of $2 laid down on an auction table and the laughter that followed. The chairman of the board adjusted his glasses and began to speak. And as the first question left his lips, she realized that this fight was no longer just about saving a burned silo. It was about proving that something dismissed as worthless could become the heart of a town if only given the chance. But whether the board would see it that way remained uncertain, and the room seemed to hold its breath as the hearing truly began. The first question from the county chairman was simple on the surface. Do you understand that this structure was declared unsafe after the fire? His voice carried the calm tone of someone used to procedure. Papers rustled around him. Pens hovered over forms. She stood straight, hands resting lightly on the back of the wooden chair in front of her. Yes, sir. I understand it was unsafe then. A faint murmur moved through the room. And do you believe, he continued, that it is now safe for public use? She did not rush her answer. I believe it is becoming safe. I have followed every recommendation given so far. Reinforced beams, ventilation, fireproofing around the stove. A second exit framed and ready for inspection. It is stronger now than it was before the fire. The inspector from Miller's Field glanced up from his clipboard. He did not nod, but he did not shake his head either. The chairman leaned back. Becoming safe is not the same as certified safe. Across the aisle, the development man shifted in his seat. He wore a pressed shirt and polished shoes that seemed too clean for a farming town. He had placed his blueprints neatly on his lap, as if waiting for his turn. The mayor cleared his throat from the side bench. He was not seated with the board, not quite with the townspeople either. He looked caught between two worlds. One by one, residents were called to speak. The barber stepped forward first. He spoke about what he had seen with his own eyes, about beams measured twice before being set, about sand buckets and fire safety checks, about children who now spent afternoons reading instead of wandering near the old railway tracks. A teacher followed. She spoke about budget cuts and overcrowded classrooms. She explained how the reading room inside the stone silo had become an extension of learning, a place where curiosity felt welcome. She used words like literacy and community enrichment, though her voice trembled slightly when she did. Then came a father from the diner group. He was not angry, but firm. He spoke of liability and fairness. He argued that rules applied to everyone. If one person could turn a burned agricultural structure into a public library without proper permits from the start, what message did that send? The room felt like it was being pulled in two directions. The chairman listened, expression steady. He asked about structural reports, about projected maintenance costs, about insurance coverage. Each question seemed to add another weight to the scale. When the development man's name was called, the air shifted. He walked to the front with an easy smile. He spoke of economic growth, of modern storage units that would serve farmers year-round. He described job creation and tax revenue. He mentioned that Miller's Field was underutilized land and that removing the old silo would clear the way for progress. He did not insult the reading room directly. Instead, he called it admirable but impractical. Sentiment does not stabilize foundations, he said gently. Investment does. A few heads nodded. She listened without interrupting. Her jaw tightened just slightly when he mentioned demolition costs as a minor detail in a larger development plan. When her turn came again, the chairman asked a question that seemed small but carried weight. If the board grants a temporary variance, can you meet every remaining safety requirement within 60 days? The room went quiet enough to hear someone cough near the back. 60 days. She thought of the roof anchoring that still needed stronger steel brackets. She thought of the insurance premium she had not yet been able to afford. She thought of the development proposal hovering in the background, ready to sweep in if she failed. Yes, she said. Her voice did not shake. The chairman studied her. With what funding? Before she could answer, something unexpected happened. A boy stood up from the third row. He was the same one who had first stepped into the silo weeks ago. He held a small tin box in both hands. I got money, he said, voice louder than anyone expected. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. His mother tried to tug him back down, but he held his ground. It's from my chores, and my granddad gave me some too. For books, the chairman blinked, taken off guard. Another child rose, then another. Coins clinked in jars. Crumpled bills were lifted into the air. The sound was small compared to development budgets and county funds, but it filled the room in a different way. The development man shifted again, less comfortable now. The chairman raised a hand for order, though his expression had softened. "This is not a fundraising drive," he said gently. "We are discussing legal matters," but the gesture had already changed the tone. An elderly woman from the back stood slowly. She had lived in town longer than most could remember. "That silo," she said, voice thin but clear, "was built by my father and his brothers. They laid those stones by hand. It survived drought and war and fire. If it can survive that, it can survive paperwork." A faint laugh moved through the crowd, easing tension for a brief moment. The chairman conferred quietly with the other board members. Papers were passed back and forth. The inspector whispered something that made one of them nod thoughtfully. Finally, the chairman addressed the room again. "The board will take this under advisement. We will review the structural updates, the proposed timeline, and the development application. A decision will be announced in 1 week. 1 week." The words landed like a countdown. Outside town hall, people gathered in small clusters. No one celebrated, no one despaired outright. The waiting felt heavier than any verdict might have. She stepped down the stairs slowly, children still clutching their jars. The barber joined her, wiping his hands on his apron, though there was no hair to cut. "You did good in there," he said. "It ain't done," she replied. Across the street, the development man spoke quietly into his phone, likely updating someone far away about the situation. His expression suggested confidence, but there was a tightness around his eyes. Over the next few days, the town seemed to exist in a suspended state. Work on the silo resumed carefully. Every remaining safety requirement was tackled with urgency. The farmer arranged for a steel supplier from the next county over to donate brackets at a discount. The retired mechanic volunteered to inspect the stove installation again, making sure every fitting met code. The teacher helped draft a formal budget plan, detailing projected costs and maintenance schedules. It was typed neatly and submitted to the board along with a petition signed by more than half the town's residents. Yet tension lingered. Late one evening, she returned to find a new paper tacked to the silo door. This one was not official. It was handwritten. Progress matters more than nostalgia, no signature. She stood there for a long time, reading the sentence over and over. The words were not cruel, but they carried a warning. Not everyone believed the silo deserved saving? She removed the paper quietly and folded it into her pocket. The next day, survey stakes appeared along the far edge of Miller's Field, thin wooden markers with bright ribbons fluttering from their tops. The development company had begun preliminary measurements, confident that approval might come their way. Children noticed first. "They're marking it," one girl whispered. The sight of those stakes made the conflict feel real in a new way. The old burned silo no longer stood alone against memories of fire. It now stood against metal units and paved lanes and something cleaner, shinier, less rooted. At dusk, she climbed the ladder once more to inspect the roof anchoring. The wind was steady, but not harsh. From that height, she could see the entire field, the survey stakes, the town beyond. The mayor approached below, hat in hand. "They're moving fast," he said, looking out at the markers. "So are we," she answered. He hesitated. "If the board sides with development, the town council will have to approve land transfer. That vote will be close." She absorbed that quietly. "You still believe this is worth it?" he asked. She looked down at the round stone walls beneath her boots. "I paid $2 for it," she said. "But it's never been about money." He nodded slowly, though uncertainty lingered in his eyes. As the final day before the decision arrived, the silo stood stronger than it had in decades. Steel brackets secured the roof cap. The second exit door swung open smoothly. Fireproof insulation lined the stove area. An insurance application lay pending, backed by pledged donations. Inside, the shelves were fuller than ever. Books had come in from neighboring towns, sent quietly by people who had heard about the fight to save a burned silo turned reading room. That evening, without announcing it publicly, she unlocked the door and lit the lantern. Children slipped in one by one as if afraid to break a rule. Adults followed, standing along the curved walls. No one spoke loudly. It felt less like defiance and more like farewell, though no one said that word. She began to read. Her voice carried through the stone chamber, steady and warm. The story she chose was about rebuilding after loss, about planting seeds in soil once thought ruined. The words felt close to home. Outside, the sky darkened. Not with storm clouds this time, but with the weight of anticipation. When she finished the chapter, she closed the book gently. No applause came, only silence. Tomorrow, the board would announce its decision. The development man would likely be there with his blueprints. The mayor would stand somewhere between hope and obligation. The survey stakes would either become permanent markers or be pulled from the ground. She looked around the room at faces lit by lantern glow. At children who had found their place among shelves of stories. At neighbors who had chosen to stand together despite disagreement. The old burned silo felt alive in a way no one could have predicted at that auction. As the lantern flame flickered, she realized that whatever happened next would shape the town for years to come. Outside, in the quiet field, the survey ribbons fluttered in the night breeze, waiting. Morning came slow and pale over Miller's Field. A thin layer of fog hovered just above the grass, wrapping around the old stone silo like a quiet promise. The survey stakes still stood at the far edge, ribbons hanging limp in the still air. The door to the reading room was closed, the lantern inside long extinguished, but the feeling from the night before lingered. By 9 o'clock, the town hall steps were full again. No one had slept much. The children came with their parents this time, not carrying jars of coins but holding hands. The barber stood beside the farmer. The teacher had a folder tucked under her arm. Even a few from the diner group showed up, faces serious but not unkind. She walked up the steps alone, the same way she had the week before. Her dress was simple, her boots clean. She did not look like someone about to argue. She looked like someone ready to accept whatever came. Inside, the county board members sat at the long table. The chairman adjusted his glasses once more. The development man was present too, blueprints stacked neatly at his side. The mayor stood near the wall, hat pressed to his chest. The chairman cleared his throat. After reviewing the structural updates, the submitted safety plan, the insurance application, and the public testimony, he began, "The board has reached a decision." The room felt tight as a drawn string. The structure formerly known as the Miller Silo is granted a provisional variance to operate as a community reading room and public gathering space. Pending final inspection in 60 days? For a second, no one reacted. The words hung in the air, almost too light to carry meaning. Then someone let out a soft breath that turned into a laugh. A child clapped before being hushed, but it was too late. Relief rolled through the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. The chairman raised his hand again. "This variance is conditional. All safety requirements must be fully completed and documented. If standards are not met, the permit will be revoked." She nodded once. "They will be met." He gave her a long look, not unkind. "We expect they will." The development man leaned back in his chair, expression measured. His proposal had not been approved, but it had not vanished entirely either. The board announced that any development plans for Miller's Field would require further review and, importantly, would not proceed while the provisional permit remained active. It was not a defeat for him, it was a delay. But in that moment, delay felt like victory for the silo. Outside, word spread fast. When she stepped down the stairs, the children rushed forward first. "Does that mean it stays?" one asked. "It means we get to keep building," she said. The barber shook her hand, his grin wide and unguarded. The farmer clapped her on the shoulder hard enough to make her laugh. The teacher wiped her eyes and pretended it was dust. Even a man from the diner group approached quietly. "You proved your point," he admitted. "Long as it's safe, it will be," she replied. That afternoon, Miller's Field felt different. The fog had burned away. The survey stakes still stood, but they no longer looked certain. A few volunteers began pulling them from the ground without ceremony, stacking them in a neat pile by the fence. Work resumed with new energy. The steel brackets were tightened and double-checked. The second exit door was painted bright red so it would be visible in any emergency. Proper signage was installed. The insurance policy was finalized with help from a retired accountant who had been watching from the sidelines until now. Each step was documented carefully. Photographs were taken, receipts were filed. The once burned silo was becoming one of the most thoroughly inspected buildings in the county. The development man visited the field one more time. He walked the perimeter quietly, studying the stone walls and the newly reinforced roof. She met him near the entrance. "You have strong support," he said. "It's not just mine," she answered. He glanced toward the town where children were running between the oak tree and the silo door. "Progress can take different shapes," he admitted. "And sometimes it looks old before it looks new," she replied. He tipped his head politely. "If this fails, the offer stands." She did not argue, she simply nodded. But inside she felt something steady and certain it would not fail. 60 days passed faster than anyone expected. The reading room reopened officially the following weekend with a small sign over the door that read Miller's Field Reading Room. Someone had carved it by hand and painted the letters carefully. It was simple, honest. Families brought pies and lemonade. The pastor offered a brief blessing, speaking of resilience and shared purpose. The mayor stood near the entrance, smiling more freely than he had in weeks. The county inspector returned for the final review. This time, his clipboard felt lighter in his hand. He checked the brackets, tested the door swing, examined the stove fittings. He reviewed the insurance documents and the maintenance plan. Finally, he stood in the center of the round room and looked around. Sunlight streamed through the 2 round windows, casting bright circles on the whitewashed zone. The shelves curved gracefully, filled with books of every kind. A bulletin board near the entrance listed reading schedules, volunteer shifts, and upcoming community events. Children sat cross-legged on the floor, waiting quietly. He closed his folder. "Certified," he said. The word was simple, but it carried the weight of every nail hammered, every coin donated, every argument made. Applause broke out this time without restraint. Even the inspector smiled faintly. The provisional variance became permanent. The development proposal quietly faded. Investors looked elsewhere. Miller's Field remained open and green, anchored by a round stone building that no longer wore the label burned with shame, but with history. Over time, the reading room grew into something larger than anyone had first imagined. It hosted evening literacy classes for adults who had once been too proud to ask for help. It held town meetings where voices that had clashed before now found common ground. It became a place where farmers read agricultural guides together and children discovered stories beyond the horizon of their fields. The old silo that had been bought for $2 became the heart of the town. Visitors from neighboring counties came to see it. They asked about the fire, about the auction, about how one woman had turned a burned structure into a community library. The story traveled farther than she ever had, yet she never sought credit. When people praised her, she pointed to the beams and the brackets and the shelves. "It wasn't me," she would say. "It was us." The mayor often stopped by in the evenings, sitting quietly near the stove. "You changed this place," he told her once. She shook her head gently. It was ready to change. Even those who had opposed the project found themselves inside the reading room eventually. A man from the diner group was spotted reading a farming journal at the back table. Another brought his granddaughter for story hour and stayed longer than he meant to. A tension that had once split the town softened into something more balanced. Disagreements still existed, as they always would, but they no longer felt like threats. They felt like conversations. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low over Miller's Field, she stood outside the silo and looked up at the roof. The steel brackets caught the light. The stone walls glowed warm. The barber joined her, hands in his pockets. "Hard to believe it was almost torn down," she nodded. "Hard to believe it was ever called worthless." He laughed softly. $2. She smiled at the memory of the auction laughter. "Best $2 I ever spent." A group of children ran past them, racing toward the oak tree. Their voices carried across the field, bright and free. The burned silo had become more than a reading room. It was proof that something damaged could be rebuilt stronger. It was proof that community mattered more than convenience. It was proof that progress did not always mean tearing down the old to make way for the new. Sometimes progress meant restoring what had been forgotten. As evening settled, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled of wood and paper and something steady. She lit the lantern out of habit, though electric lights had been added along the curved walls. She ran her hand along the cool stone, the same way she had the first night she stood there alone after the storm. "You stood," she whispered. Outside, the field stretched wide and open, no survey stakes in sight. The story of the burned silo for $2 would be told for years in that small American town. Not as a tale of conflict alone, but as a reminder that value is not always visible at first glance. That community can rise from ashes. That a simple reading room inside a stone silo can change hearts as surely as any grand building. And as the lantern light glowed against the round walls, it was clear that what had once been shocked laughter had turned into something far stronger. It had turned into pride.